Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Bill Dunn, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, Future-Proofing Your Retail Enterprise, the Power and Flexibility of Headless Commerce. To eliminate any background noise, we've gone ahead and muted everyone's microphones. However, if you do have any questions during the presentation, feel free to enter in the chat, and we will address them as we go along. We will also hang around for 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. And if you don't at that time, feel free to drop off. We will have video on demand available after the fact as well. In today's webinar, we're going to be discussing headless commerce. It's a hot topic of interest, and we want to help demystify it. We realize that you may be here for different reasons. Maybe some of you have already implemented headless and are looking for best practices, or maybe you're considering headless and want to get a deeper understanding of it. Our goal is to make sure you walk away with a sound understanding of it and the impact it can make to your business. We'll discuss what headless is, why it's growing in popularity, the benefits, different headless solutions, migrating to headless, and the costs. We'll show its impact both from a business perspective and an architectural standpoint. Now, as a reminder, if you have any questions during the webinar, please post them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to address each of them. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joe Cronyn, Senior Software Architect with JBS Custom Software Solutions, and Dan Fertig, VP of Agency Partnerships at BigCommerce. Joe, please tell us a little something about yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Bill. Like Bill said, my name is Joe Cronyn. I joined JBS Software in 2017 as a developer, and I work on the architecture group, helping provide architectural oversight to our teams. Have a master's degree with a specialization in microservices, and today's topic and kind of looking at services and how those can interplay with using microservices will be, some of what I'm talking about today.
Yes, and thanks, Bill, for having me. Dan Fertig here, looking forward to the conversation today with you, Joe, and with you all. Thank you for joining. For the last 4.5 years or so, I have managed agency partnerships for BigCommerce. So my team and I have hundreds of merchant conversations, helping advise them on approach with technology stack, as well as working closely with our incredible delivery partners like JBS to really solution and architect the right solutions and right outcomes for our joint customers. So really excited to share some of the learnings from a holistic standpoint. BigCommerce serves close to 70,000 merchants globally. And so hopefully some of what I can share today is the collective learnings and best practices and approaches from that large base of merchants as well.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Bill. So today we're going to start off with kind of the high-level question: what is headless commerce? And we're going to start with what is headless in particular. So as the quote on the screen says, software that works on a device without a graphical user interface. So when we think about software, traditionally in older monolithic type systems, the head or the front end of the application experience, whether that's a website, a mobile application, et cetera, a lot of that functionality and a lot of that user experience is being served up by the same system that's doing all of the back-end processing and contains all the business logic for your application. So as we said before in the quote, there is no kind of head. There's no graphical user interface there with headless services. So what that means is that there's a clean separation between the back-end implementation and responsibilities and the front-end implementation and responsibilities. This is really something that's kind of become common practice in software and development in general, especially modern development. A lot of teams using Agile and creating microservices and splitting out responsibilities of their systems allows them to make the best decision for each piece of their infrastructure, as opposed to having to use one large application to service all of that. Next slide, please. So what is headless commerce? And what specifically are headless commerce services. So we've talked about headless, but what does that really mean and how does that interplay with commerce? So as we were saying, headless services are just a way of offering some form of a service in a headless manner. What that traditionally is going to mean is it's going to look like APIs or some other sort of integration method. So you can take your custom software application or your previously vended or otherwise sourced solution, and you can either integrate that with or migrate that over to using a headless solution. So headless commerce services are really just a set of managed services that are kind of centered around commerce, meaning cart, checkout, payment, fulfillment, all of the traditional things that we think about when we think about e-commerce. We're talking about abstracting those and building those out as something that clients can come in and use in a prepackaged way without having to have a large amount of investment to build out those systems themselves. So these services are managed by a third party. And again, like when we were talking about headless, you're typically going to integrate with them with some form of an API integration. And what headless commerce services really allow you to do is that, again, you get all of that base functionality with high availability, reliability. Essentially you have a technology partner in your service provider who is developing, managing, resourcing, monitoring, alerting, and completely kind of handling the day-to-day logistics of all of those services. And so that takes a lot of the responsibility off your shoulders and allows your organization to focus on, what makes you special and, focus on your product, focus on your message, rather than having to focus on being, a software shop that can manage an entire commerce infrastructure. So on this next slide, we're going to take a quick moment and just compare some different kind of solutions, and this will review some of the points we've already talked about. So starting from the left, this is kind of the thinnest or most direct way to integrate with a headless commerce service. And so in this example, we just have a front end, and that directly plugs into the headless commerce service backend. And so for companies, especially smaller organizations who may not have existing infrastructure, may not have an existing website, this allows them to get up and running very, very quickly. So you can, spin up a WordPress site, create a custom React application, a mobile app, and hook directly into your service provider's commerce APIs. And so without you having to develop any sort of backend, they will manage users, customers, logins, orders, carts, products, and all of this information for you, as well as having rich functionality on top of that. Like I know, Dan, for instance, BigCommerce, you guys have lots of tools for merchants to use to look at, forecasting and trends. And so you get all of that on top of having that functionality out of the box.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even the ability to integrate into third-party analytics solutions like Google BigQuery and understand profit margin at an individual product level, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know we'll get into that a little bit more detail later on. So moving to the middle, this is kind of a little bit more of a customized look at how you would utilize a headless commerce service. And this kind of speaks to, very directly, I think these first two, the skill set that kind of JBS as a technology partner would bring to the table and, help your organization with migrating to one of these sorts of infrastructures. So in this middle one, it's very similar to the first example that we looked at, except for in between the front end application and the headless commerce service that you're using, you can develop a layer of microservices. And what these are going to do is they're going to sit between those two, and they're going to enhance and allow you to extend the functionality of your headless commerce service. So as an example, you may have certain business requirements. Like I know in JBS's example, we have clients that ship alcohol between states. And so there's lots of additional rules about what can be sent where, about, taxes, about dates you can ship things, et cetera. And, traditionally a headless commerce service, unless they're very specialized to that industry, they're probably not going to have a lot of rich functionality around, specific use case things like this. So what microservices allow you to do, and following a microservice pattern allows you to do, is to implement that layer of functionality to support your specific business needs on top of those basic kind of components, the cart, the checkout, et cetera. So you can, put those rules in and gate transactions and, do whatever it is that you need to do for your business, but still not have to do most of the heavy lifting as far as all of the commerce functionality. And then lastly, just for comparison, and it may seem like maybe this is an advantage when we look at the monolith, that, hey, it's only one box, it looks so simple. But realistically, we're taking a lot of different things here and we're rolling them all up into one. And so what traditionally has happened with monolithic architectures and why companies have moved away from them is that as that platform begins to age and begins to rot, as the information that was used to develop it disperses, and you may not have people around that understand fully how your system works, that not only affects one layer of your application, it's affecting your front end user experience, it's affecting your business logic, it's affecting your basic commerce functionality. And so over time, it becomes more and more expensive and more laborious for you to continue to kind of support a monolithic system, as opposed to trying to migrate to one of these patterns that we've shown on the left. And again, we will definitely kind of dive into some more detail on that as we go through the rest of the slides. So next, I just wanted to give kind of like a really high level overview of like, what does this space look like? Like, if you haven't heard of Headless, if you haven't heard of headless commerce, what is this? Is this a niche thing? Are there a few people doing it? And really, no, when you look at Headless, at least in the way that we're viewing it in the context of this discussion, it's really any service that's out there where you can interact via APIs only, without kind of a user experience required to get the benefits of that integration. So we've blown up this infographic here, and you can see just the sheer number of services that are out there for organizations to take advantage of today. So in this list, we have obviously, of course, BigCommerce is on there under commerce services, but we have a lot of extremely well-known APIs like Google Maps, MasterCard, Elastic, Intuit, If This and That, and AWS, just to kind of name a few of these without going through all the names on the list. So there's lots of industry verticals here, infrastructure, Internet of Things, commerce, content management. And what these things allow you to do is, again, when we talk about, the cost of developing and the cost of maintaining these sorts of systems, they allow you to externalize that and not have to deal with the pain points of, managing development teams, managing workflows, managing user expectations, translating that into business criteria, all of the traditional things that we do in software. That again, if that's not the focus of your business and you want to be focusing your efforts on, your product and your message and, how you're actually developing sales or, developing your company, it allows you to focus on that rather than, having to focus on, again, the root functionality that allows you to get there. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dan. Like,
Yeah.
There's a lot of companies on here. Like, what have we seen in the last 5 years that has just caused this extreme growth in this space?
Yeah, and it's unsurprising to see the explosion in API services, right? In the industry. This is good news for merchants, good news for brands that are looking to differentiate without having to build all of these unique connections themselves. The fact that we're working now in a more API first open economy is a good thing for total cost of ownership and for flexibility for brands as well. You can go to the next slide, Bill. I think what we have seen in our business are really three key shifts that in commerce that are impacting, the brands that are selling, whether they're traditional retailers, whether they're brands traditionally selling through retailers or B2B. A full 30% of brands and merchants that work with BigCommerce now are considering or are implementing a headless commerce implementation, which given our start in SMB pure play SaaS, to the transition over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of opening our platform to be able to serve these types of customers, we're doing it in response to increased market demand. And that's being, like I said, impacted by 3 main shifts. The first is the disruption of traditional brands and traditional distribution channels. Think of, the rise of the digitally native brand, right? That's selling direct to consumer, unencumbered with all of the infrastructure and headaches and big business and channel conflict of the traditional consumer goods companies and manufacturers. They are purpose built to be able to disrupt the large consumer packaged goods companies and brands of the world. And so brands are now fighting back, right? And they've largely built their businesses on things like social commerce and paid advertising. And brands, bigger traditional incumbent brands, are now looking to fight back. So there's this war happening for consumer mind share, and the battleground isn't where it used to be. And I'll touch on that more in a moment. The second is a generational shift. What we're seeing drive the consideration for headless commerce of B2B buyers. If you think about today's B2B buyer, it's the average B2B buyer, according to most reports, is 33 years old. And that consumer grew up in a digital first way, right? They are not looking to fax orders. And so, and nor do they want to work in an archaic, heavy to use system. And so, manufacturers need to think about both who's buying their products and how they want to be buying them, as well as the people that come work for me. Are the systems that I use like interesting for these people to be working through, or are they going to be hitting their head against the keyboard trying to make it work? The last is, we call it sometimes the fight against templatization or commoditization of commerce and e-commerce, right? And the idea that there's this direct-to-consumer playbook, and you could just follow it and grow revenue 50% year over year. It is becoming more complex, right? There's a very well-worn quote that today, innovation is happening at its fastest pace ever. It is also happening at the slowest pace it will ever go, all on the same day. And, brands need to be thinking about these things and making sure they're able to adapt to the current changes and be able to react to future changes as well. And so, next slide, please. Those 3 shifts are creating a new reality for the brands that we work with and the brands that we don't work with today, right? So the first is that to be able to continue revenue growth, customer base growth, it has become clear that they need to be selling where their customers spend time, right? That means today it's oftentimes, especially obviously accelerated with COVID, less about store shelf space, and it could mean more about YouTube, right? If that's where your consumers are spending their time. And so you need to be thinking about, how do my customers want to be able to buy from me? And how can I reach them? That also means the lines between marketplaces and search engines and social media have blurred, right? Customers are demanding convenience. I joke that 5 years ago, we all thought Facebook was a social media ad platform and Amazon was a marketplace. Well, it turns out Amazon is actually the 3rd largest advertising platform now. And Facebook and Instagram have become a social commerce marketplace, right? If you're not thinking about your social commerce strategy, you're missing out on a very large swath, about 1 billion users a day, right? And last but not least, brands need to adopt a user-centric strategy to be able to adapt to changing customer needs, right? And expectations, right? User experience used to primarily mean pre-purchase. Where are you on the store shelf? What does your personalized customer experience online look like? Well, now it also means post-purchase. We live in a world where I want to be able to know exactly where my package is and when it's going to get delivered, right? And what's really interesting is that a lot of that innovation is happening on the periphery with, best of breed point solution apps that are building exactly that, right? It's companies like Route that can tell you where your package is, offer you insurance. I mean, monoliths of the past, and you can turn to the next slide, we're not built for that, right? If you think about the monoliths of the past, almost all of them that are in market today were launched and built before the invention of the iPhone. And so the idea that you're going to use them to get a leg up on your competition and be flexible and cost effective and experience centric is just you're missing out on a lot of the innovation and a lot of the best of breed applications that are rising as the flywheel spins. And you saw a lot of those API first software solutions, Joe, early on your slide as well.
Yeah, and Dan, I think that's one of the greatest comparisons I think I've heard, right? Is like if your servers and your software and all of that was before the iPhone was even invented, I mean, I wouldn't want to switch back to a phone from back then. So I'm not sure, where the argument is for continuing to stay on those sort of antiquated systems when, to your point, you're missing out on so much benefit from all the innovation that's happened over these, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, retro is cool again, but not when it comes to serving customers. And so I love this quote on the next slide from Gartner. They released a recent quadrant around headless, and they talked about this quote, and I thought it was incredibly powerful. Right, by 2023, not that long from now, organizations that have adopted a composable or microservices oriented approach will outpace competition by 80% in the speed of new feature implementation. This reminds me a little bit. We had a customer that recently signed with us, and we're not the only platform that offers this. So we are. This is not a BigCommerce plug, but this is a customer that was on a monolithic platform, and they had spent like 6 weeks and tens of thousands of dollars trying to integrate with Apple Pay to make Apple Pay offered on their mobile experience. And they could have been a BigCommerce customer or a handful of other platforms that offer this out of the box, and literally like pressed a button and made it available to their customers. And that example, the customer example, really struck me when I saw this quote. And so that's really what this is about. It's about feature implementation, adaptability as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And going right into the next slide here, I'm going to start talking about shared responsibility, and I think that's is a perfect segue. So what is shared responsibility? I mean, some of you may be familiar, if you're familiar with AWS, they have a shared responsibility model, a very well-defined kind of example of this. But in a more general sense, I'm just going to talk about, what is shared responsibility and like what are the benefits of it, and what does it actually mean? So why should you trust a managed solution, right? At the end of the day. And I think that's a big question that we hear from a lot of our clients, that we hear from a lot of prospective clients, and that's heard in the marketplace a lot is, if I've been running things like this, and Dan, to your point, yeah, there's been all this innovation, but I've got my server and I've got my IT guys. Why would I trust someone else to run this? My IT guys are the best, and my server hasn't shut down in 5 years, so I must be golden. Why would I hand that off to someone else who could screw it all up for me? Well, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the message is that you're still going to have your engineers. You're still going to be, doing your own thing. As far as I'm not sure if you should have, an actual server sitting in your office, but you'll still have your own services you're managing. You'll still have your own things that you're focused on. But like we were saying earlier, it's really about like focusing on what's important to you, right? And so unless you are a business that is in the, possibly a competitive BigCommerce, and you're in the space of creating commerce experiences and commerce APIs, well then, yeah, so, maybe using a commerce headless service wouldn't be what you would be looking for. But if you're a company that's in this space that needs these services and that's been previously manually managing these or paying licensing fees and, hundreds of thousands of dollars for engineers to come on and support the system, it kind of is, it's an interesting point that we're at, honestly, technologically, where there are so many options out there and so many services out there that will provide you high availability, high performance, well-managed solutions that honestly, for you to get the same level of availability, and just have the same solid platform that you'd be able to take on from your provider would be an immense cost, because obviously they have put tons and tons of money into developing their platform and making sure that it's ready for their customers. So the shared responsibility is really speaking to just that, right? you get to take all that responsibility, all those things you would have been responsible for, and you get to shift that off onto whoever you decide to go with as a service provider. So what does that actually look like? If we go on to the next slide, you know, we're really talking about the functionality of the platform. And so it's not only the things that I was mentioning before, as far as availability, performance, uptime, et cetera, right? Like those are all things that I think are the table stakes, if you will, right? Like any provider that you're looking at should have high availability, should have, you know, good performance, should have support that's there for you if things go down. But, you know, more so, what's the functionality of the platform that you're getting? And how much investment would that be for you? And to Dan's point with the Apple Pay example, right? I've been previously at a company, and you know, for some of our clients, have done Apple Pay integrations and other integrations like that. And you know, those efforts go well. To his point, you know, you're 4 or 6 week, you do your agile timelining, you get all your requirements together for how to implement it, you put it together. But if your company's bread and butter isn't commerce, and if instead at an organizational level, at a high level, you had made a decision to, hey, like, let's use a commerce service, then turning on Apple Pay would be, you know, a business person somewhere in his office clicking a button that says turn on Apple Pay.
Yeah.
It would be turned on.
And I would, you know, there's some balancing act there, Joe, between, you know, focusing on the user experience and optimizing and growing, but there are considerations around, you know, risk reduction and things like that, right? So PCI compliance, tax calculation. You gave an example earlier on around, you know, the wine and spirits industry, right? Well, there are very specific tax solutions, really two in particular, that can calculate taxes and regulations by state in the wine and liquor industry, right? So does the platform I work with have those requisite integrations? Accessibility, right? Lawyers are looking for violations of ADA compliance. Are you an expert in ADA compliance? You know, if not, you probably want to be working with folks that know a thing or two about it to make sure you don't, you know, get hit with a lawsuit that you kind of have to settle on lest you go to court. So it's both, you know, optimizing user experience, driving revenue growth, and then also managing risk against that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we move on, we just have a question in the chat. How or where do you see ERP fitting into headless commerce? And are you seeing direct API integration into something like SAP or Oracle? Or are you seeing the ERP proxied by the commerce tools?
So I can touch on that a little bit, Joe, and if you'd like me to take a first stab at that, and then
yeah, you can take a first stab at it.
So, you know, we do see a great number of customers integrating our platform into their ERP, and in that way, they tend to be managing the enterprise, the out of the ERP, the product information, the customer information, et cetera. And in that way, they tend to think of, and by the way, this is a good way to think about it. They tend to think of, you know, our platform or e-commerce generally as a channel through which they sell, right? But they may be using that ERP as a source of truth for their wholesalers and for, you know, the retail businesses that they work with, and for their tax and accounting business units. And so many of those businesses use those systems to push data to different systems. The consideration there, whether or not, you know, I can just sell directly through my ERP with a punch out system, or do I want to use an intermediary, for lack of a better term, like a commerce platform, is how much you focus on things like merchandising and promotions, right? And channel mix, as well as data orchestration, right? So if you have a very simple product, you push simple catalog out to simple places, it's much easier. You may want to consider going direct from your ERP to any PO system or whatever that is. But if you are thinking about, you know, how to merchandise, how to cross-sell, how to upsell products, how to make reorder easily available, cross-sell across your catalog of solutions. Like, you may want to have a platform like ours or a competing platform to be able to help orchestrate all of that information. And the nice part is a platform like ours or one that's capable, has a lot of those channel integrations as well. So if I want to decide to list my products on Walmart, I can just, again, connect my BigCommerce with a button, press of a button, and start deciding which products I want to sell on Walmart. So it comes down to your individual business requirements. But we do see, obviously, there are people that choose not to use an e-com platform and use their ERP in order to drive to purchase orders and things like that.
Yeah, and to throw a little bit of extra color on it, or I guess just agree with you. Yeah, I would say the exact same that you were saying towards the end there, right? It's kind of it's not something that there's one answer for everyone, right? It's going to be very dynamic based on your business, based on what you have in place. Historically, what your roadmap looks like, what your budget looks like. There's all sorts of factors, right? But at the end of the day, I think the answer is that Dan was getting to, and that I would like to reiterate, is that, depending on the provider that you're choosing for those commerce services, it's going to vary how much you can actually do something like that with a commerce service. So I know, for instance, Dan, I don't think you had mentioned it or brought it up directly, but like, I know there's SAP plugins for BigCommerce, and so when you're talking about, I have an ERP, can I plug in? That definitely gets to a, does the service provider you're choosing have that feature, or does someone have a plugin that allows you to do that, right? But in a very general sense, yeah, I think the decision as far as whether you continue to utilize something like your ERP by itself, or you choose to use a headless commerce service, is more of kind of a high level business decision. And I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking for return on investment. And if headless commerce services can push your company in the right direction, save you money, or make you more money, or both,
yeah,
that's kind of where that decision should lie, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's typically pretty easy just from an operational efficiency standpoint to justify, having the commerce platform in there. I mean, we have integrations into just about every leading ERP, whether it's SAP, Oracle, Bright Pearl, NetSuite, Microsoft, Infor, you name it. We have, clients using integrations there. So yeah, it's based on the business requirements. Good question there.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So next up, we're going to talk about why headless. We've kind of talked about what headless is. We've talked about some of the benefits, the shared responsibility as far as not having to worry about those base commerce functionalities. But, using headless commerce, what does that actually look like? And what are the trade-offs? What are the costs? So here we're going to kind of touch on these three main points that are on the slide: customization, data migration, and support are going to be the main topics that we're going to look at. So for customization, honestly, from a development standpoint, from a software development lifecycle standpoint, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, Dan, but you're going to get to focus on what's important to your company. And at the end of the day, that's the majority of the change when it comes to customization. So instead of having your development teams focus on customizing your platform and managing that platform at the same time, they're purely focused on taking this service that you've brought in, the service provider, looking at their API specification and extending that and layering functionality on top of that. So, and the beautiful thing about that too is, and I'm sure you've probably heard stories of this, Dan, is when you're in like a full custom software stack top to bottom, the quality of your technology provider, the quality of your engineering team matters a lot more, because it's very easy to make problems for yourself by changing things you shouldn't, putting code down into like basic cart functionality, let's say, and then that messes up something over here with cart functionality you weren't thinking about, right? But if there's this clean separation where, BigCommerce is handling, or your service provider is handling all of your, cart, checkout, et cetera, and it's a black box, you can't touch any of that, right? That's theirs. Then everything you're building on top of that is going to respect that boundary, which is really nice. So from a software development standpoint, from a customization standpoint, I actually view that as a huge benefit. And I think by using a service like this, it really kind of gives you a clean separation of responsibilities between your commerce provider and your in-house development teams that are working on that project. So the next point, migration. This is definitely a touchy subject, and I'll loop you in a minute here, Dan, because I'd like to get your perspective. I know you guys do a lot of work with clients to help get them migrated. But you know, at the end of the day, if you're going to migrate platforms, if you're going to be moving systems, data migration is almost always going to be a part of that. As an example, let's say, you know, you have all of your existing systems. You have your customer, you have your cart, you have your checkout, you have your orders. So, all right, I want to start moving things over. I want to move my products over. So you have to look at what does their import tool look like? What does their migration path look like? Also, we'll talk about choosing a provider. This is important to consider when you're choosing a provider too, is, you know, what does that path to migration look like, and how well documented is it? How much support do they have for that process? Because if it takes you 2 or 3 months to get migrated because of a lack of support and a lack of documentation, it's going to end up costing you a lot more than if you were able to migrate in a few weeks.
Yeah,
Dan, take it away.
Yeah, that's a great call out, Joe. The only thing I would add here is, you know, people, you know, especially, you know, people who are passionate entrepreneurs and care about the customer, they do wake up sometimes saying, man, like, I can't wait to launch this new website or commerce experience for my customers. Like, it's an exciting moment to launch a new e-commerce site. Very few sane people that I know would say, I cannot wait to migrate all of this data into the new platform. Like, Tuesday morning, let's get after it. So, you know, that is, it's an oftentimes underlooked component to a successful launch. We work with agency partners like JBS, of course, but BigCommerce does offer its own, you know, we scope the project and we handle the data migration elements for you. We do it because we've done thousands of them at this point. And so we want to make sure we get it right. And no one's tripping over any potential stones and getting that data out of an external system and into our system to be able to launch confidently with the right customer data, order data, product data, et cetera. So it is an overlooked but really critical component to launching any site, for sure.
No, absolutely. And that's a critical service you guys offer, you know, because you have customers at all experience levels with I'm sure all manner of engineering talent or lack of, you know, some people probably have no engineering team and they have this database they need to get over. So I can totally see how that would be such an advantageous thing for you guys to offer. And like you said, JBS also, we have, you know, lots of experience doing data migrations and moving data from one system to another for our clients in the past. So working with a technology partner who has the experience, working with a service provider who has that experience, you know, obviously is a great way to reduce the amount of expenditure, the amount of time that you're spending trying to get that migration completed. But like we've said, yeah, I don't think many people wake up happy for data migration. At the end of the day, though, if you make the right decisions, it can reduce that friction and make the whole process not as painful as it could be, let's say. So next off, we're going to talk about support. And in a similar vein to my migrations and data migrations, Dan, I definitely want to call on you to kind of give me some perspective on what support means to BigCommerce. Because I do think, you know, just from our experience with you guys, that you guys do a great job of providing support. I know there are other companies that their support is either very limited or very expensive.
Yeah.
So, you know, like we've been saying, this is definitely something you want to consider when choosing a partner. But, you know, viewing this as a benefit, again, if this was your system, if you own the whole system, that support is wholly on your shoulders, right? Yep. So you have your PagerDuty rotation, you have your engineer who's on call, and you're paying those people, stressing them out in the middle of the night when the system goes down, et cetera. So the beauty, again, is you're shifting that responsibility, you're moving that support off, and you're allowing the support of the actual commerce system to completely fall within the responsibility of your service provider. But then with a provider that provides you that additional level of customer support, you also get support on integration, you get support on, you know, errors or bugs you're having. You get support on performance issues. I mean, I'm sure you can probably talk more to this, Dan, with the experience you've had with customers.
Yeah, it is certainly the customer support is a part of it. And, typically if there's heavy digital strategy, digital transformation, user experience design, and systems integration work, we'll rely on great partners like you, Joe, to help customers figure that out. In terms of supporting the overall implementation and then post-launch customer success, it's a major part of our value proposition. What is interesting is that it has evolved to allow us to bring to bear some deep insights we get from the broader scale of what's working and what's not, what's successful, what channel mixes work for different verticals and industries that we can guide both in the form of content and in individual conversations our merchants on. And even some of the deep partnerships that we have that allow us to bring some of that intelligence to our clients as well. So a great example is we had a call, with the agency partner and a merchant recently where we asked Google to run a report for us on the merchants that advertise on Google, which is a lot of them, almost all of them, through BigCommerce. And Google was able to tell us as one of their strategic partners, which of those merchants are literally not spending enough money on paid search, meaning that if they up their spend, there are enough people searching for that term where their return on ad spend would go up, their cost per click would go down, and their revenue would increase. And they're giving us those deep insights that if you're just an individual merchant and you try to doing $10 million a year online or $25 million a year online, and you try to get Google to give you that information, they're like, is your name Expedia? No, then no, I'm not giving you that level of information, right? Yeah. But the scale there is what allows us to provide the intelligence back to the merchant base.
Well, that and the insights, to your point, right? So you've got employees that are looking at the platform, looking at things like this, asking those questions, having those conversations. And so even if you were at that scale, you're investing in all those same things to do those things independently for yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the benefits of having that, service provider and partner that you can lean on and that, you get a lot of benefit from is a model that I think, we're going to see a lot more of in the future. So next off, we're going to talk about making the right choices. And we've kind of prefaced this with a lot of the talk we've been having about, make sure we're looking for somebody who has a great support. Make sure you're looking for someone that can potentially help you with data migrations, or at the very least has a very well documented, platform as far as how you can get onto their platform. But really, on this slide, I wanted to dive and just kind of do a high-level overview of some of the topics that are important when we're talking about making the right choices for choosing from a technological perspective. And then I'll toss it over to Dan to kind of delve a little bit more off of what we've been talking on, business reasons or business benefits at a very high level that you get from making the right choice versus potentially making the wrong choice, choosing a partner or choosing a service. So a lot of these we've already mentioned, but obviously availability is a huge one. If you're online today and your website goes down for any length of time and you have a lot of traffic coming to it, those are usually, bad times for businesses. You have lost revenue. A lot of times you have lost customers because, there's some percentage of those customers who are probably going to say, I'm not coming back. Like, this website's been down for a whole day. And, availability is definitely something that is almost more of an expectation or a table stake today, I think, at the marketplace. Same with reliability, as well as some of the other things we've talked about with relation to data migration support, right? These are kind of the base things that you want. Now, there may be some scenarios where maybe that isn't the most important thing to you. And I know, leading up to this webinar, Dan, we talked a lot about this, right? Like, all these things we're saying are very variable. Like, if you have the greatest support team in the world and they're financed for the next 20 years and your company doesn't, need support, then, maybe your decision-making process is a little bit different than a company that doesn't have that, right? There are anomalies everywhere. Every company is not going to be in the same stage from just a organizational life cycle sort of perspective. But drilling down a little bit further, what we really want to look at is the feature set. Like, what feature set does your provider offer now? What did they offer in the past? And, based on that, what does their innovation pipeline look like? And what does the future of that platform look like? The next thing we want to look at is related to this is prepackaged customizations. So along with, where has the platform come from? Where is it going? What kind of tooling is already available on that platform? Whether it's third-party tooling like plugins that I know you were saying, Dan, earlier, you guys have a lot of external parties that submit plugins and submit applications that can integrate with BigCommerce. Again, just with the click of a button, going into a management panel, doing some configuration, you can be up and running. So those sorts of things and having those built into the platform of choice is really a huge benefit. And lastly, and all of these kind of roll up into this is cost, right? Going back to what we were saying about like the decision is going to be different for everyone. Ultimately, that support scenario we were talking about is really a cost thing, right? Because we're saying there's already got some cost over here for support. If we're going to look for a platform, let's try to get one that's cheaper and maybe doesn't include support. So similarly, any of these type of things, right, you're going to look at and say, well, is there a way I can mitigate that, or does my organization really need that? But ultimately, Dan, I think, we had talked about, I think some of the really biggest ones are the innovation, like what is your, the history of the platform and the company you're choosing to work with look like? Like, have they been a market leader? Have they been an innovator? Or have they been chasing someone else's coattails and, second or third best in the industry and trying to keep up? And, where do you want to be on that scale? Do you want to be leading in the industry and have all the newest features? Or do you want to be maybe a year or two behind? Yeah. And then next is, again, you guys have a huge suite of partners with the technology side. So looking at that as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I always say it's really key 3 pieces of functionality. It's functional requirements. Does the platform fit your functional requirements? 2, it's history of innovation, right? When there's a new technology that comes out, is this platform seemingly one of the first to get it integrated? And do they have third-party developers building into their ecosystem? And then the last, to your point, is total cost of ownership. And that's everything from cost to implement, the licensing fee, cost to maintain, cost of downtime if it's not stable and secure, right? Like all of those things, cost of third-party plugins if there's not the native functionality there. There's no one right platform for every merchant, no matter how many marketers at different companies, sometimes ours as well, when you think there are. So it's really important to really vet the technologies that you end up making a bet on. And similarly on the agency side, right? I always say, the agency decision is as important oftentimes as the platform decision, because technology is technology. What somebody does with it is typically the most important value add. And so, you want to make sure that, an agency that you select has the relevant experience in the industry on the platform, has referenceable customers, is, in the budget that you're looking for, has the availability, can hit timelines that you're requesting, and is really honest with you and not just saying yes to everything because they think that's what you want to hear. The most important question in a conversation is why, right? Why is that important? Why do we want to do that thing? Why are you thinking about that, not this? So I always encourage that level of conversation, but more often than not, I do recommend working with an agency partner, especially the brands that have complex requirements. It's the same reason, you wouldn't go and try to build a house yourself. You'd work with a general contractor because, they're a deep generalist and they know the right sprinkler company and the right electrical company and the right plumbing company and can bring those together on a blueprint that they've laid out that lets you be really intelligent about what the finished product should look like. In the interest of time, we can there's a lot to talk about there, but we can keep going. So, really quickly, how does Headless let you differentiate? So this is actually interesting, kind of a list of like who should be thinking about headless commerce, right? And so, if your goal is to design a highly immersive shopping experience, right? And you'll notice we highlighted highly immersive shopping experience, not the powered by a secure and reliable commerce engine, right? If you're a very experience-led, experience-driven brand, so examples on our platform would include, Black Diamond or Yeti Cycles. They have sponsors, and they're very content forward in an immersive experience. It's a PWA environment. They're very content first in terms of how they sell. And then it's, oh, by the way, we have the product that you just watched the video on. You can buy that, on our site direct to consumer as well, right? The second is, improving time to market. So we have a client, HMD, Nokia. Nokia, if you're familiar, they sell handsets and telecommunications equipment. I mean, they had a major investment in an existing content management system, and they needed a platform that could integrate into that content management system. So you always want to think about what are the right third-party front ends that the platform, e-commerce platform, integrates into. And so in the case of Nokia, I mean, they were able to launch across 4 countries in 89 days, under a quarter, getting out launched direct to consumer business in under a quarter, right? The third is creating multi-channel and omni-channel experiences. And that's really about, being where your customers are. And so the example, I mean, we've had clients that, run surf parks and sell surfboards, and you can visit the surf park and pick a board, even if you're just a beginner, and spend all day surfing at that surf park, fall in love with the board, and soaking wet, walk out of the surf park and up to a on-site kiosk, purchase the board you just spent all day getting to know and love, and it gets delivered to your door before you get home, right? That's an incredible, localized omni-channel experience, right? And so they do that with a headless implementation. And the third is continuously innovate, right? And so if you're the kind of brand that says, I just want, one tech partner and I need them to do everything for me, those are not typically the types of brands that are choosing a headless commerce implementation, right? They want a more modular approach. They want to pick the right solutions for them when they're the right solutions for them. And, modular composable approach allows them to do exactly that.
Yeah. And, Dan, I think that's a great call out, like having it be modular, having it be composable. I think we started off with you having a quote about, innovators, or rather companies that are heading towards a microservices approach and that kind of a pattern are going to outpace the competition. I think he was like 80%, right? So ultimately, yeah, I mean, that's very much a pattern we like to follow at JBS as well. The microservice approach in general. And so I think headless services, and especially headless commerce, like as an engineer, my perspective is, if I walked into a situation, they were like, well, we're going to use BigCommerce for all the commerce things, I would say, oh, thank the Lord. Like, that's so much work that we get to offload, and, we get to integrate with them and get all of this functionality. And they're not asking me to build that out from scratch.
Right.
So, looking at it from that perspective, it's a different world that we're living in as far as developing software compared to, 10, 20 years ago. So at this point, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Dan and we've convinced you, you're ready to migrate, and you say, headless services sound like something that, are going to be good for me, good for my company. How do I go about doing this? What does this actually functionally look like? So the diagram on the slide may look very familiar, mostly because I think most agile workflows or infographics kind of follow some sort of, there's bubbles and arrows like this. But like we were talking about earlier, no solution is going to be the same for any two people. So we can't really get too much into like the details of what exactly are you going to step through, right? Like if I could give one piece of documentation that would tell any company how to migrate to a headless commerce service, let's just say I would be publishing documents like that and not working as an engineer, because those would probably sell for a lot of money. So when we look at the headless services and how to integrate with these, and you leverage them to provide a modern, stable foundation, again, it's going to follow a pretty traditional pattern. So up front, you're going to do your evaluation. This means not only evaluating your potential technology partner if you're pulling one in, not only evaluating the platforms that are out there that you could choose from, but also evaluating your systems in the current state of affairs, right? That's probably actually the most important part. So you need to have a really good understanding about where you are before you start thinking about where you're going or how to get there. Once you have a complete picture, you've evaluated kind of all ends of things, and you think which technology partner or which service provider you want to go with, then you would start planning. So you'd say, okay, well, at a high level, what does this plan look like? develop your, very generic business requirements around what functionality is going to be required, what potentially you want the user experience to look like. And in the case of migrating to a headless service, maybe the user experience is, the expectation is it's not going to change, right? So a lot of these are, you have an existing e-commerce site and you want to migrate over to using headless commerce, but on the front end to the user, there shouldn't be any perceivable change. And so you're going to reap the benefits of not having to manage those systems, but it doesn't really go along with some sort of huge reinventing your brand or reinventing your website sort of effort. It's purely just getting the benefits of moving off and having a commerce service provide that functionality as opposed to doing it yourself. So once we get onto that planning phase, again, we get some high level requirements. We groom those with the engineering team and come up with more specific development requirements. Then we dive right into implementing. Now, around this part, you can see, there's some arrow going backwards from test. So when we go into implementing, it's not always advisable to implement this all in one large chunk, right? So if commerce is most of what is going on in your application right now, and you're offloading that because you want to get out of being responsible for that and focus again on what makes you different and what's important to your company, then there's a lot of things to move there, right? I mean, we're customers, orders, like we were talking earlier. So all of those commerce systems have to move. It's not necessary to move those all at the same time. And actually what we would usually advise in most cases is to break those out into the separate individual systems, if you will, or the separate individual APIs of your service provider. So I know in the case of BigCommerce, I know there's separate customer APIs and separate product APIs, and it is entirely possible for a customer to migrate their products over and begin using product APIs, but use the rest of their remaining infrastructure, and then move customers over and start using those APIs, and be able to piecemeal it out like that, so it's not one large shift. So after we go through the implementation phase, and again, whether that's a piecemeal thing or whether you're doing it all at one time, depending on the size of what that effort would look like, you'd obviously want to test all of this thoroughly. So typically that looks like standing up a testing environment. All of the providers, I would suspect, if not, then the vast majority of them should have test environments that you can work against, where you can use test credit card numbers and fake products and place orders, and make sure that your entire user experience end to end is working before you launch that out into production. And then finally, once you feel really good about everything, assuming again that you didn't have to traverse back to plan some more because you ran into an unexpected issue, or maybe again, if you're breaking this into pieces, you could launch each piece individually and then go back and plan again, implement again, test and deploy again. You get to your final launch phase, everything is out there, and at that stage, what should be remaining is either that your application is now a microservice on top of BigCommerce that provides your custom functionality, or that would be kind of your last remaining piece. So if you've not been decommissioning, your existing monolithic application, let's say, as you were going along and moving things off to your service provider, that would kind of be your last cleanup effort. Would say, okay, now let's go through and get rid of all of this unused code, all of these things that we're not going to have to manage anymore. And, again, at that point, you're there, you've made it, you're on BigCommerce or you're on your service provider, and they're managing all of that commerce functionality for you. So you can start to strip away all of that additional responsibility from your engineering teams. And Dan, I know you also wanted to talk about looking to the future on the next slide. So again, we've convinced you. We've kind of given a high level overview of the migration. And at this point, let's say you're migrated, Dan. Now what? What are you looking to do after you've migrated?
Yeah, and I'll be quick just in the interest of time. I know we're coming up short on time here. I like to use the example of Lark. I always recommend clients be thinking about what is the next thing that I need to be thinking about for my customer experience. So Lark is a good example. They were a successful business on BigCommerce. They had launched the Kickstarter and then launched in 4 different countries. And they make self-cleaning sanitizing bottles. So when COVID hit, as you can imagine, demand exploded for their products, right? So they were able to very quickly figure out how do I launch in a dozen different markets in the course of the next month. They ended up launching in several dozen markets over the course of about 30 days, understanding the tax implications, what are the right solution providers in the different areas. And now where they're thinking is, how do I get to purchase number 2 and 3 on my product? And what is my next product? And how do I drive loyalty? How do I drive referrals around my business? And so they're very much thinking about customer lifetime value and enhancing the referral business that they bring in, as well as the loyalty business to drive second, third, and fourth purchases. And so, it's a good example of someone being able to nimbly adapt to a drastically changing environment, and also be thinking about what's next for their business around, new product enhancements, new markets, and loyalty programs for their customers as well. So I always like to give that example. And if anyone who's interested, feel free to contact me. We do have a case study on our website. And they're a good example of somebody who chooses our platform, right? I'll use Gartner's words. BigCommerce is best fit for experience-driven brands trying to differentiate on business agility, fast time to market, and user friendliness. So a good example there, Lark, of a business that's doing exactly that. Joe.
And I think with that, I'll hand it back to Bill.
Thank you, Joe and Dan. With that, the presentation portion of our webinar is complete. But before we open it up to questions, I'd like to let you know about JBS Quick Launch Lab. For a limited time, we're offering today's audience an opportunity to get a free analysis of your requirements to determine if BigCommerce is a fit. If you're interested or would like to learn more, click the link in the chat box to sign up. And with that being said, let's move on to today's Q&A portion of today's webinar. Who is headless commerce not a fit for?
I could start that one maybe and then hand off to you, Dan.
Sure. Yeah.
Because to keep it short, headless commerce is not for you if everything is working for you right now. And I think, we had talked about this earlier in the week, right, Dan? Is if your company is in the perfect spot, you've got a 10-year plan, you're extremely profitable, everything is working, you don't have any future case where you need to scale, you're golden and you can't see any problems for the foreseeable future. That would be, I think in most cases for any, advocating for any sort of a shift or any sort of a change, if you're in that scenario, this is definitely not for you. But Dan, I'm sure you also just have some probably more specific examples from the past where you've worked with people and it just hasn't worked out or it hasn't been the best fit.
Yeah, and so a couple of different considerations. I think, not everyone has a product like, Black Diamond ski gear, where, it's highly immersive, highly sponsor driven, content first. Some people sell widgets and that's perfectly fine. And they have a fairly simple product catalog, a fairly simple buying experience. And they're not necessarily worried about like future proofing that business. That's been they've been in business for 82 years, and people can buy online through their current user experience. And that's not somebody who has to be thinking about what's next, what new channels, they can be, but if it's working for you, to your point, Joe, why introduce that complexity? Also, there are investments both with BigCommerce and some of our competitors where we do and continuously make investments in the front end flexibility and usability of the platform. And so if you're not already invested in a third party front end, or you don't necessarily need that highly differentiated user experience, for a good number of brands, like whatever's out of the box in our platform or some other type of system that has a native front end, it may be perfectly fine for your business, right?
Yeah, that's a great call. Like a small business that doesn't really have the capital or resources to do something like a headless approach would be much better suited to just do a full end-to-end solution.
It's exactly right, because especially initially on, it does introduce sometimes a great, more complexity than just using what's out of the box in a commerce system, especially if you're not already invested, in a third-party application on the front end. Exactly. So it's a real consideration, right? I said 30% of customers are looking at headless. That's a really high number. That also means 70% aren't. And so, and that number is, triple what it was 24 months ago. So it's growing fast, but, it doesn't mean it's for everybody. So, it's a great question.
Up next, what heads do we recommend merchants consider?
I can touch really quickly on that. And I'm sure, as an architect, Joe will have an opinion on that as well. I think the fundamental question that people need to answer is, do I use a system that's already has a connector with my commerce platform? And am I already invested in a particular head, right? Whether that's Acquia or Bloomreach or Drupal or Contentful, right? There's no shortage, WordPress, there's no shortage of third-party front ends. And so, if the platform you work with has connectors and those connectors work well and the front end is not particularly cumbersome from a usability or price standpoint, I oftentimes recommend starting there. If you're already invested in a third-party front end, whether that's Adobe Experience Manager or anyone else, then obviously integrating that with the commerce platform is not a bad idea. And then there's the whole, do we want something a bit more bespoke, built from React or for another type of technology as well? Joe, you may want to touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. From a custom built perspective, essentially the answer is that you could use anything. When we're really talking about making a choice in that space, it's more the generic conversation of, well, what front end platform should you choose to develop in and why, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're working with one of these modern service providers, again, they are traditionally going to have very robust APIs. A lot of them have standard development kits that they provide, so you don't even have to write all of that client interface code. You just have to call native code in the browser to be able to hit their APIs. And so at the end of the day, again, it comes down to your point as well. Like I would say if React, let's say there was a open source library that plugged into BigCommerce and someone was looking for a reactive front end customized for BigCommerce, and I would be like, hey, let's use React versus one that doesn't have that, right? But at the end of the day is you can plug in with anything. And that's the beauty of Headless, is that by having that abstracted API interface, you could literally, you could do native iOS, native Android, you could do Xamarin, you could do React, you could do Vue, the list goes on and on. There's no platform that I would say can't integrate with BigCommerce. It's just a matter of what's best.
Exactly. Yeah, the Black Diamond example, they use Contentful as CMS and then Vue.js as a PWA. So you can get really creative.
Yeah, and it's also, do you have employees that already know React, that already know Vue? Do you have existing custom web app potentially that you can leverage?
All right, we got two more quick questions. How do you combat potential breakage from having disparate systems talking to each other in a microservices format versus a monolith all-in-one solution?
Yeah, I can jump on that. Certainly, it's something we think about all the time, and we're very careful about when we do these implementations. I would say make sure you have a good delivery team, whether that's a partner, an agency like JBS, or you have an in-house team to be able to do it. Just in terms of the delivery itself, there are additional considerations when you're doing a headless implementation. The other part of it is, BigCommerce has, I think, the third largest app marketplace of any e-commerce platform in the US, and but it's not bigger because we have very rigid certification criteria, and we do testing and certify all of the different applications that are coming into our app ecosystem. And so you want to make sure you're using an application that has been verified by whatever commerce platform you choose. You want to know the versioning, you want to know that there's the quality control, and that if you implement a third-party app, it's not going to break whatever you've already set up. So you want to do QA, you want to make sure that you're using a verified app in an app marketplace of any e-com platform that you choose. All of those things are important considerations.
Yeah,
And
and
one final, sorry, go ahead,
I
Joe.
think to your point, Dan, it's very much like more of it's the generic kind of same things you should be thinking about with software, right? So when we're writing software, do we grab some open source library no one's heard of and 5 people use? Probably not. Do we use the super popular one that lots of people have looked at and reviewed and say is good to go? Yes. And then do we use it without testing it? No, right? So it's a lot of these same paradigms that when you're working in a modern development team on microservice architectures, I think the biggest thing, the biggest shift, if you will, is to never have a breaking change. And I would think any service provider out there should know that when you're working in this sort of a pattern, you cannot change your API contracts without versioning or otherwise, moving those APIs somewhere else and keeping the old version and developing a new version. And that's an extremely common pattern. So when we talk about concerns about things breaking because of all these independent contracts and how are they interacting, it's more that there's a very rigid agreement, a loose agreement, but a very rigid contract, if you will, between kind of the industry on how APIs should be developed. And that's been something that we've seen, I think, develop, and a lot of people start to follow more and more and more over time. But there's definitely been, not to lie, back in the early days when all of these kind of concepts were first coming out, there were lots of instances on the internet of obviously people shifting things or changing things without necessarily intending to, that would have negative consequences. We've just gotten a lot better as an industry at avoiding those sorts of things.
All right, we got one final question. How are third-party applications vetted so that one-click integrations are guaranteed not to break other features already installed?
Yeah, I can touch on that. I mean, BigCommerce has a team dedicated, so I can only speak for our platform, but we have a team dedicated to vetting third-party applications. So there's a fee, and one needs to submit an application to be listed in our app marketplace. There's about a 30 to 60 day, depending on the complexity or review process of that application, vetting the technology and blessing the technology. There's no guarantee that some deep customization that was made on a client site, though, will 100% of the time without fail, work. And so, to Joe's point, do you just want to click the button and cross your fingers? No. You should be testing to make sure applications work with your desired outcomes, user experiences, and the stack that you put together as well.
All right, Joe and Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of the day. I just want to remind everyone that this will be available on our website via video on demand within the next day or so.